Lucius volunteered for gladiator school, thinking he would learn to fight like a hero and win his freedom through courage. What he didn't know was that gladiators were deliberately kept weak with plant-based diets, trained to make their deaths look spectacular rather than fight to win, and forced to share beds with the decaying bodies of yesterday's losers, because Roman crowds paid to see beautiful deaths, not actual combat. Welcome to Historical Stories for Sleeping. Before we begin this incredible story of Lucius, whose dreams of heroic combat in the Colosseum taught him that Roman gladiators were entertainment slaves trained to die beautifully rather than warriors fighting for glory, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you believe that sometimes the greatest courage is simply surviving another day, hit that subscribe button and share this story to help us honor those who endured history's cruelest spectacles. The morning Lucius walked through the gates of the Ludus Magnus Gladiator School, he carried with him the dreams of every young Roman who had ever watched the games from the cheap seats. He was 18 years old, strong from years of farm work, and utterly convinced that courage and skill could overcome any obstacle. In his mind, the arena represented the ultimate test of manhood, a place where heroes were made and freedom could be won through valor. What Lucius didn't understand, as he signed his name to the gladiator contract with hands that trembled more from excitement than fear, was that he was not entering a school for warriors. He was volunteering for an elaborate slaughterhouse designed to produce entertaining deaths for the amusement of Roman citizens who had grown bored with simple executions. The Ludus Magnus was the largest and most prestigious gladiator school in Rome, located just across from the Colosseum itself. Its walls were high and thick, ostensibly to keep intruders out, but actually to keep the gladiators in. The moment Lucius stepped through those gates, he ceased to be a free Roman citizen. He became property, expensive property, to be sure, but property nonetheless. "Welcome to your new life," said Gaius Brutus Maximus, the lanista who owned and operated the school. Maximus was a former gladiator himself who had won his freedom after 15 years in the arena, though the scars covering his body told the story of what those 15 years had cost him. You think you understand what you've signed up for, boy, but you don't. Nobody ever does. The contract Lucius had signed was written in language designed to be misunderstood. While it spoke of training, combat, and the possibility of earning freedom through victory, the fine print told a different story. Gladiators were bound to fight whenever their owner commanded, against whatever opponents he chose, under whatever conditions he deemed appropriate. They could not refuse a match, could not retreat from combat, and could not leave the school grounds without permission. Most importantly, they belonged to their lanista until they either won their freedom, something that happened to fewer than one gladiator in 100, or died in the arena. The first thing you need to understand, Maximus continued as he led Lucius through the school's courtyards, is that the games are not about fighting. They are about entertainment. The crowd doesn't come to see skilled warriors test their abilities against each other. They come to see blood, drama, and death. Your job is not to survive. Your job is to give them a show worth remembering. The gladiator school was larger than Lucius had imagined, built around several courtyards where different types of fighters practiced their skills. He saw men training with nets and tridents, others learning to fight with sword and shield, still others practicing with exotic weapons from across the empire. But what struck him most was how thin they all looked. These were supposed to be the greatest fighters in Rome, yet most of them appeared malnourished, their muscles lacking the bulk he had expected from professional warriors. "You're wondering why they look so weak," Maximus observed, noticing Lucius's expression. "That's your first lesson. Gladiators are not fed to be strong. They are fed to be entertaining. A powerful warrior who kills his opponent quickly provides only a few moments of excitement. A weakened fighter who struggles, bleeds dramatically, and dies slowly can entertain the crowd for an hour." This was Lucius's introduction to one of the darkest secrets of gladiator combat, the deliberate weakening of fighters to make their battles more visually appealing to spectators. Strong, well-fed gladiators might end their fights too quickly, denying the crowd the prolonged spectacle of suffering that they craved. Weak gladiators, on the other hand, would struggle against each other for extended periods, bleeding profusely from wounds that would be minor inconveniences to healthy men, creating the dramatic combat that made the games profitable. "But surely," Lucius said, his voice already showing doubt, "the best fighters are rewarded? The ones who show the most skill and courage." Maximus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "The best gladiators are the ones who die beautifully, the ones who provide the most entertainment as they fall. Those are the gladiators that the crowd remembers, the ones who inspire poets and artists, the ones who simply win. Well, they're useful until they stop being profitable." As they walked deeper into the school, Lucius began to notice other details that challenged his assumptions about gladiator life. The sleeping quarters were cramped and poorly ventilated, with multiple men sharing beds barely large enough for one. The training equipment was designed more for show than for developing real combat skills. And everywhere he looked, he saw signs of a system designed not to create warriors, but to produce a specific kind of spectacle. The other gladiators watched him with expressions that mixed pity with resignation. They had all been where he was now, young, hopeful, convinced that they could overcome the system through sheer determination. They had all learned the truth eventually. Some learned it quickly and adapted to their new reality. Others fought against it until it broke them. But all of them, without exception, had discovered that the arena was not a place where heroes were made, but where heroes came to die in ways that would entertain the mob. "Tonight you'll be assigned a cell and given your first meal," Maximus said as they completed their tour. "Tomorrow your real education begins. And boy, forget everything you think you know about fighting, everything you think you know about honor, everything you think you know about courage, because in here, those concepts mean something very different than they do in the outside world." That night, lying on a straw mattress that reeked of sweat and fear, listening to the sounds of other gladiators praying, weeping, or simply trying to find sleep, Lucius began to understand that he had made a terrible mistake. But by then, it was far too late to change his mind. Lucius's first meal as a gladiator consisted of a bowl of barley porridge, so thick it could barely be stirred, accompanied by boiled beans that had been cooked until they were little more than mush. There was no meat, no cheese, no wine, none of the foods that free Roman citizens took for granted. When he asked about this, thinking perhaps it was a temporary situation until proper rations could be arranged, the other gladiators looked at him with the weary patience of men explaining basic facts to a child. "This is the gladiator diet," said Marcus, a veteran fighter who had been in the school for 3 years. "Barley, beans, and vegetables. Nothing else, except on special occasions when they might give us some stale bread or watered-down wine. But how can we be expected to fight without proper nutrition?" Lucius asked, "How can we build the strength needed for combat?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "You still don't understand, do you? We're not supposed to be strong. We're supposed to be soft." The gladiator diet was one of the most carefully calculated aspects of the entire system. It had been developed over centuries of experience, refined to produce fighters who would provide maximum entertainment value while minimizing the cost of feeding them. The high-carbohydrate, low-protein diet served several purposes, none of which had anything to do with the fighter's health or combat effectiveness. First, it kept the gladiators weak and slow. Men fed primarily on grains, and legumes lacked the explosive strength and quick reflexes that came from a diet rich in meat and fat. This meant that their fights would be longer and more dramatic, as weakened opponents struggled against each other for extended periods rather than ending combat quickly with decisive strikes. Second, the diet made their bodies soft and prone to bleeding. The lack of protein meant that their muscles remained relatively small and poorly developed, while the high carbohydrate intake caused them to retain water and develop a layer of soft tissue just under the skin. When such bodies were cut, and they would be cut frequently and deliberately, they bled more dramatically than the lean, hard bodies of well-fed warriors. Third, the plant-based diet affected their mental state. Without the steady energy that came from animal proteins and fats, gladiators experienced mood swings, depression, and a kind of mental fog that made them more compliant and less likely to rebel against their conditions. A constantly hungry, nutritionally deficient fighter was easier to control than the well-fed one. "Look around you," Marcus said, gesturing at the other gladiators in the eating area. "Do any of us look like the warriors you see depicted on mosaics and frescoes? We're all soft, pale, weak. That's deliberate. The Lanista wants us weak." Lucius studied his fellow fighters with new eyes. It was true. Despite being professional combatants, none of them displayed the powerful physiques he had expected. Their muscles were poorly defined, their skin had an unhealthy pallor, and most moved with the careful, deliberate motions of men who were constantly conserving their limited energy. "But surely," he said, "there must be gladiators who refuse this diet, who find ways to eat properly." "Oh, they try," Marcus replied. "New arrivals always try. They attempt to trade their belongings for meat, or they try to catch rats and birds to supplement their meals. But the guards watch for that. Anyone caught eating unauthorized food is punished severely, and the punishments are designed to be educational." He pointed to a gladiator sitting alone in a corner, a man whose hand shook constantly as he tried to eat his porridge. "That's Quintus. Last month he managed to catch and eat a pigeon. The guards caught him with feathers in his teeth, so they broke 3 of his fingers and told him that next time they'd break his arms. Now he can barely hold a sword, which means his next fight will be his last." The systematic nutritional abuse didn't stop with just limiting protein. The school's cooks, who were themselves slaves, though of a higher status than the gladiators, were instructed to prepare food in ways that maximized its visual appeal while minimizing its nutritional value. Vegetables were boiled until they lost most of their vitamins. Grains were processed to remove fiber and nutrients. Even the water was often contaminated with additives that would make the gladiators more docile. "There's something else," Marcus said, lowering his voice so the guards couldn't overhear. "Something they don't tell you until you've been here longer. The food isn't just about keeping us weak. It's about controlling how we die." He explained that the gladiator diet was carefully calculated to affect how their bodies would respond to wounds. The high carbohydrate intake increased blood flow, meaning that cuts would bleed more dramatically. The low protein levels meant that wounds healed slowly and were prone to infection. Even the timing of meals was planned. Gladiators were often fed heavily before fights, so that when they were cut, their blood would be bright red and flow freely, creating the visual spectacle that audiences craved. "They've turned our own bodies into weapons against us," Marcus said. "Every meal we eat makes us more entertaining to watch die." But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the gladiator diet was the constant hunger. No matter how much barley and beans they consumed, the gladiators were always hungry. The lack of protein and fat meant that their bodies never felt truly satisfied, leaving them in a constant state of craving that affected their ability to think clearly or plan effectively. "The hunger is the worst part," admitted Gaius, another veteran fighter. "You think you'll get used to it, but you never do. It's always there, gnawing at you, making you weak not just in body but in mind. Sometimes I dream about meat, just a simple piece of roasted chicken, and I wake up with tears on my face." This psychological effect was another deliberate aspect of the system. Hungry, malnourished men were easier to control than well-fed ones. They were more likely to comply with orders, less likely to plan escapes or rebellions, and more willing to accept their fate as entertainment for others. The constant physical discomfort also served to break down their sense of self-worth, making them more accepting of their status as disposable property. As they walked deeper into the school, Lucius began to notice other details that challenged his assumptions about gladiator life. The sleeping quarters were cramped and poorly ventilated, with multiple men sharing beds barely large enough for one. The training equipment was designed more for show than for developing real combat skills. And everywhere he looked, he saw signs of a system designed not to create warriors, but to produce a specific kind of spectacle. The other gladiators watched him with expressions that mixed pity with resignation. They had all been where he was now, young, hopeful, convinced that they could overcome the system through sheer determination. They had all learned the truth eventually. Some learned it quickly and adapted to their new reality. Others fought against it until it broke them, but all of them, without exception, had discovered that the arena was not a place where heroes were made, but where heroes came to die in ways that would entertain the mob. Tonight you'll be assigned a cell and given your first meal, Maximus said as they completed their tour. Tomorrow your real education begins. And boy, forget everything you think you know about fighting, everything you think you know about honor, everything you think you know about courage, because in here, those concepts mean something very different than they do in the outside world. That night, lying on a straw mattress that reeked of sweat and fear, listening to the sounds of other gladiators praying, weeping, or simply trying to find sleep, Lucius began to understand that he had made a terrible mistake. But by then, it was far too late to change his mind. Lucius's first meal as a gladiator consisted of a bowl of barley porridge, so thick it could barely be stirred, accompanied by boiled beans that had been cooked until they were little more than mush. There was no meat, no cheese, no wine, none of the foods that free Roman citizens took for granted. When he asked about this, thinking perhaps it was a temporary situation until proper rations could be arranged, the other gladiators looked at him with the weary patience of men explaining basic facts to a child. "This is the gladiator diet," said Marcus, a veteran fighter who had been in the school for 3 years. Barley, beans, and vegetables. Nothing else, except on special occasions when they might give us some stale bread or watered-down wine. But how can we be expected to fight without proper nutrition? Lucius asked, "How can we build the strength needed for combat?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "You still don't understand, do you? We're not supposed to be strong. We're supposed to be soft." The gladiator diet was one of the most carefully calculated aspects of the entire system. It had been developed over centuries of experience, refined to produce fighters who would provide maximum entertainment value while minimizing the cost of feeding them. The high-carbohydrate, low-protein diet served several purposes, none of which had anything to do with the fighter's health or combat effectiveness. First, it kept the gladiators weak and slow. Men fed primarily on grains, and legumes lacked the explosive strength and quick reflexes that came from a diet rich in meat and fat. This meant that their fights would be longer and more dramatic, as weakened opponents struggled against each other for extended periods rather than ending combat quickly with decisive strikes. Second, the diet made their bodies soft and prone to bleeding. The lack of protein meant that their muscles remained relatively small and poorly developed, while the high carbohydrate intake caused them to retain water and develop a layer of soft tissue just under the skin. When such bodies were cut, and they would be cut frequently and deliberately, they bled more dramatically than the lean, hard bodies of well-fed warriors. Third, the plant-based diet affected their mental state. Without the steady energy that came from animal proteins and fats, gladiators experienced mood swings, depression, and a kind of mental fog that made them more compliant and less likely to rebel against their conditions. A constantly hungry, nutritionally deficient fighter was easier to control than the well-fed one. "Look around you," Marcus said, gesturing at the other gladiators in the eating area. "Do any of us look like the warriors you see depicted on mosaics and frescoes? We're all soft, pale, weak. That's deliberate. The Lanista wants us weak. Lucius studied his fellow fighters with new eyes. It was true, despite being professional combatants, none of them displayed the powerful physiques he had expected. Their muscles were poorly defined, their skin had an unhealthy pallor, and most moved with the careful, deliberate motions of men who were constantly conserving their limited energy. "But surely," he said, "there must be gladiators who refuse this diet, who find ways to eat properly." "Oh, they try," Marcus replied. "New arrivals always try. They attempt to trade their belongings for meat, or they try to catch rats and birds to supplement their meals. But the guards watch for that. Anyone caught eating unauthorized food is punished severely, and the punishments are designed to be educational." He pointed to a gladiator sitting alone in a corner, a man whose hand shook constantly as he tried to eat his porridge. "That's Quintus. Last month he managed to catch and eat a pigeon. The guards caught him with feathers in his teeth, so they broke 3 of his fingers and told him that next time they'd break his arms. Now he can barely hold a sword, which means his next fight will be his last." The systematic nutritional abuse didn't stop with just limiting protein. The school's cooks, who were themselves slaves, though of a higher status than the gladiators, were instructed to prepare food in ways that maximized its visual appeal while minimizing its nutritional value. Vegetables were boiled until they lost most of their vitamins. Grains were processed to remove fiber and nutrients. Even the water was often contaminated with additives that would make the gladiators more docile. "There's something else," Marcus said, lowering his voice so the guards couldn't overhear. "Something they don't tell you until you've been here longer. The food isn't just about keeping us weak. It's about controlling how we die." He explained that the gladiator diet was carefully calculated to affect how their bodies would respond to wounds. The high carbohydrate intake increased blood flow, meaning that cuts would bleed more dramatically. The low protein levels meant that wounds healed slowly and were prone to infection. Even the timing of meals was planned. Gladiators were often fed heavily before fights, so that when they were cut, their blood would be bright red and flow freely, creating the visual spectacle that audiences craved. "They've turned our own bodies into weapons against us," Marcus said. "Every meal we eat makes us more entertaining to watch die." But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of the gladiator diet was the constant hunger. No matter how much barley and beans they consumed, the gladiators were always hungry. The lack of protein and fat meant that their bodies never felt truly satisfied, leaving them in a constant state of craving that affected their ability to think clearly or plan effectively. "The hunger is the worst part," admitted Gaius, another veteran fighter. "You think you'll get used to it, but you never do. It's always there, gnawing at you, making you weak not just in body but in mind. Sometimes I dream about meat, just a simple piece of roasted chicken, and I wake up with tears on my face." This psychological effect was another deliberate aspect of the system. Hungry, malnourished men were easier to control than well-fed ones. They were more likely to comply with orders, less likely to plan escapes or rebellions, and more willing to accept their fate as entertainment for others. The constant physical discomfort also served to break down their sense of self-worth, making them more accepting of their status as disposable property. As the weeks passed, Lucius felt the effects of the diet in his own body. His strength decreased noticeably, his reflexes slowed, and his skin took on the pale, soft appearance that marked all long-term gladiators. But more disturbing than the physical changes were the mental ones. The constant hunger made it difficult to concentrate, and he found himself becoming increasingly passive and accepting of conditions that would have outraged him just weeks earlier. "This is what they want," he realized one day as he struggled to lift a practice sword that would have felt light in his previous life. "They're not just preparing us for combat, they're preparing us for death, and they're making sure that when we die, it will be slow and bloody and entertaining." The diet was working exactly as intended. Lucius was becoming exactly what the Roman crowds wanted to see. A weakened, softened victim whose suffering would provide an afternoon's entertainment for people who had never known a day of real hardship in their lives. 3 weeks into his training, Lucius discovered that gladiator school was not about learning to fight. It was about learning to die in ways that would satisfy an audience that had seen every possible variation of human suffering. The revelation came during his first formal training session, when he was paired with Titus, a veteran gladiator who had survived 4 years in the arena by mastering the delicate balance between providing entertainment and staying alive. "Forget everything you think you know about combat," Titus said as they stood in the training courtyard, wooden practice swords in their hands. "Real fighting is about ending the threat as quickly as possible. Gladiator fighting is about making the threat last as long as the crowd wants to watch." The instructors, former gladiators who had won their freedom and now taught the deadly arts to new generations of fighters, began by teaching not attack techniques, but theatrical techniques. Gladiators learned to fall dramatically when struck, to cry out in pain at precisely the right volume, to carry to the upper seats of the arena, and to bleed in ways that would be visible from hundreds of feet away. "The crowd can't see your face clearly from their seats," explained Brutus, the chief instructor. "So everything you do must be large, obvious, dramatic. A simple sword thrust is an entertainment, but a sword thrust that sends blood spraying in a wide arc, that makes you stagger backward with your arms thrown wide, that causes you fall to one knee while clutching your wound, that's a moment the crowd will remember." Lucius watched in horror as the instructors demonstrated what they called combat theater. 2 experienced fighters engaged in what looked like a fierce battle, complete with dramatic wounds, desperate rallies, and moments of apparent triumph and defeat. But when the demonstration ended, both men were uninjured. The blood was red paint, the wounds were carefully choreographed illusions, and the entire fight had been rehearsed like a stage play. "But what about real fighting?" Lucius asked. "What about actual combat skills?" "Oh, you'll learn those too," Brutus replied. "But understand, your real skills are not about winning fights. They're about losing them in ways that will make the audience demand to see you fight again. A gladiator who simply defeats his opponents quickly will find himself matched against increasingly impossible odds until he dies. A gladiator who provides good entertainment, on the other hand, can have a long career." This was the central paradox of gladiator existence. Success in the arena was not measured by victories, but by crowd approval. And crowd approval came not from skillful fighting, but from skillful suffering. The most successful gladiators were not the strongest or the fastest, but those who could take punishment dramatically, bleed attractively, and die beautifully when their time finally came. The training reflected these priorities. While gladiators did learn basic weapon techniques, far more time was spent on what the instructors called audience management. They learned to read the mood of a crowd, to escalate the drama of a fight at precisely the right moments, and to manipulate spectator emotions through carefully choreographed displays of courage, desperation, and pain. "Watch my eyes," Titus said during one of their practice sessions. "I'm not looking at your sword. I'm looking past you, at where the crowd would be sitting. I'm timing my reactions not to your attacks, but to what will get the biggest response from the audience. That's how you stay alive, by making them love watching you suffer." The weapons training itself was designed around the principle of prolonged combat rather than effective fighting. Gladiator swords were often duller than military weapons, requiring multiple strikes to inflict serious wounds. Armor was designed to protect vital organs, while leaving arms and legs exposed for dramatic but non-fatal injuries. Even the different gladiator types, the heavily armored Murmillo, the lightly equipped Retiarius, the exotic Hoplomachus, were created not for tactical variety, but to provide different kinds of visual spectacle. Each type of gladiator represents a different fantasy for the crowd. Brutus explained as he showed Lucius the various equipment combinations. The Murmillo is the steady, defensive fighter. Audiences love to see him gradually worn down by a more aggressive opponent. The Retiarius is the clever, mobile fighter. Crowds enjoy watching him dart around until he makes a fatal mistake. The Hoplomachus, with his exotic Greek weapons, represents foreign skill being defeated by Roman strength. But the most disturbing aspect of gladiator training was the psychological conditioning. New fighters were systematically broken down, their natural survival instincts replaced with an acceptance of death and a desire to perform for the approval of strangers. This process began with the diet and living conditions, but extended to every aspect of their existence. Gladiators were taught to find meaning and purpose in their role as entertainment. They were told that dying courageously in the arena was a form of service to Rome, that their suffering brought joy to citizens who worked hard and deserved diversion from their daily struggles. They were encouraged to take pride in their ability to endure pain, to see their wounds as marks of honor rather than signs of defeat. You must learn to love the crowd. One instructor told a group of new trainees, "They're your gods now. Their approval is the only thing that matters. Live to hear them cheer for you, and when your time comes, die to make them remember you forever." This psychological manipulation was reinforced through a careful system of rewards and punishments. Gladiators who provided good entertainment, regardless of whether they won or lost their fights, were given slightly better food, marginally improved sleeping conditions, or small privileges like extra bathing time. Those who failed to entertain were subjected to additional training, reduced rations, or assignment to fights against impossible odds. The system is designed to make you complicit in your own exploitation. Titus explained during one of their quiet conversations. They don't force you to perform. They make you want to perform. They make you crave the approval of people who see you as nothing more than a dancing bear. The most successful gladiators, Lucius learned, were those who had completely internalized this value system. They genuinely took pride in their ability to entertain through suffering, found meaning in their role as performers of violence, and measured their worth by the volume of applause they could generate while bleeding in the sand. There's a gladiator named Spartacus who fights in the afternoon games. Titus said, "He's been here for 6 years, longer than almost anyone. The crowd loves him because he always provides a great show. Lots of blood, lots of drama, lots of near-death experiences followed by miraculous recoveries. He could have won his freedom 3 times over by now, but he keeps choosing to stay because he's addicted to the applause. Why doesn't he just win decisively and earn his release?" Lucius asked. "Because winning decisively isn't what the crowd wants to see. And after 6 years of having his sense of self-worth tied to crowd approval, he can't imagine existing without it. He's become the perfect gladiator, a man who has learned to find happiness in his own degradation." As his training progressed, Lucius began to understand that gladiator school was not preparing him to be a warrior. It was preparing him to be a victim, a highly skilled, entertaining victim whose suffering would be refined into art for the pleasure of people who had never risked anything more dangerous than a bad bet on chariot races. The question was whether he would resist this transformation or, like so many before him, gradually learn to embrace it. If the training was designed to break down gladiators psychologically, and the diet was meant to weaken them physically, then the sleeping arrangements served to destroy whatever remained of their human dignity. Lucius discovered this on his first night in the gladiator quarters, when he was led to what the guards euphemistically called his rest area. The room was long and narrow, carved from stone beneath the main training complex. 20 beds lined the walls, if they could be called beds. Each was nothing more than a wooden platform barely 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, with a thin straw mattress that had clearly seen years of use by multiple occupants. The smell hit him immediately, a mixture of sweat, fear, human waste, and something else that took him a moment to identify: decay, the smell of rotting flesh. "Welcome to paradise," said Marcus, the veteran gladiator who had been assigned to show him the arrangements. "Home sweet home for as long as you survive." As Lucius's eyes adjusted to the dim light provided by a few oil lamps, he began to understand why the room smelled of death. Several of the beds were occupied not by living gladiators, but by corpses in various stages of decomposition. Some appeared to be recently dead, their bodies still relatively fresh. Others had clearly been there longer, their flesh turning black and beginning to separate from the bone. Why are there dead bodies in here?" Lucius asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because there's nowhere else to put them," Marcus replied matter-of-factly. "Dead gladiators can't be buried immediately. There are forms to fill out, records to update, belongings to inventory. Sometimes families want to claim the bodies, which can take weeks to arrange, and the school doesn't want to waste money on a separate morgue when they have perfectly good bed space available." The practical explanation made the reality no less horrific. Living gladiators were expected to sleep alongside the rotting remains of their former colleagues, sometimes for weeks at a time. The psychological effect was devastating and completely intentional. "It serves several purposes," Marcus continued, his tone suggesting he had given this explanation many times before. "First, it reminds us constantly of our fate. Second, it removes any illusions we might have about the value the school places on our lives. Third, it helps break down our natural human revulsion to death and decay, which is useful when you're expected to fight surrounded by blood and dying men." The sleeping arrangements were carefully designed to maximize psychological pressure while minimizing costs. Each living gladiator was assigned a bed partner, sometimes another living fighter, sometimes a corpse, depending on recent casualties and new arrivals. Privacy was non-existent, dignity was forbidden, and comfort was actively discouraged. "You're sharing with Gaius tonight," Marcus said, pointing to a bed where a middle-aged gladiator lay staring at the ceiling with empty eyes. "He's been here for 2 years, lost his last 3 fights, so he's probably got one more match before they put him against something he can't survive. Try not to take it personally if he doesn't talk much. He's in what we call the final stage." Gaius acknowledged Lucius with a brief nod, then returned to his contemplation of the stone ceiling. His body showed the accumulated damage of years in the arena. Scars covered his arms and torso. His left hand was missing 2 fingers, and he moved with the careful, deliberate motions of a man in constant pain. The bed they shared was barely wide enough for one person, let alone 2. The straw mattress was lumpy and infested with insects that bit constantly throughout the night. But worse than the physical discomfort was the psychological impact of sleeping pressed against another human being who radiated despair like heat from a fever. "The first few nights are the hardest," whispered the gladiator in the next bed, a young man named Cassius who had been in the school for about 6 months. "You'll want to vomit from the smell, and you'll have nightmares about the corpses coming alive. But you'll get used to it. We all do eventually." Around midnight, Lucius was awakened by a commotion near one of the beds where a corpse had been lying for several days. The body had begun to swell and leak fluids, creating a pool of putrid liquid that was spreading across the stone floor. 2 guards appeared with buckets and mops, but rather than removing the body, they simply cleaned up the mess and returned to their posts. "Why don't they take it away?" Lucius asked Gaius. "Because moving bodies costs money," Gaius replied in a voice that sounded like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. "Guards who handle corpses demand extra pay. Carts to transport them must be hired. Graves must be dug. It's much cheaper to let them rot here until they're skeletal enough to be disposed of easily." The economic calculation was brutal but typical of the gladiator system. Every aspect of their existence was evaluated in terms of cost versus entertainment value. Living gladiators had potential value as performers, so they were kept alive with minimal investment. Dead gladiators had no value at all. so why waste money disposing of them efficiently? But the sleeping arrangements served another, more sinister purpose. They were part of an elaborate system of psychological conditioning designed to make gladiators accept increasingly degrading conditions. A man who could sleep peacefully next to a rotting corpse was a man who had surrendered his basic human dignity. And a man without dignity was easier to control, easier to exploit, and more willing to perform degrading acts for the entertainment of others. You'll notice, Marcus had explained, that new gladiators always ask about the bodies. They complain, they protest, they demand better conditions. But after a few weeks, they stop asking. After a few months, they stop noticing. And after a year, they start to prefer sleeping next to corpses, because at least the dead don't snore or steal your blanket. The truth of this observation became apparent over the following weeks. Lucius watched as his initial horror at the conditions gradually gave way to numb acceptance. The smell became background noise. The sight of decomposing bodies became as unremarkable as the stone walls and flickering lamps. His standards for what constituted tolerable living conditions dropped so low that he began to understand why veteran gladiators rarely attempted escape. They had been systematically trained to accept conditions that any normal human being would find unbearable. The psychological impact was compounded by the unpredictability of the arrangements. Some nights, Lucius would be assigned to sleep next to a living partner. Other nights, he would share his bed with a corpse that had been a friend or training partner just days before. The guards seemed to take pleasure in these assignments, often pairing gladiators with the bodies of men they had known well. It's all part of the process, Cassius explained one night as they lay listening to the sounds of another gladiator weeping quietly in the darkness. They're teaching us that human relationships are temporary, that attachment is pointless, that death is just another sleeping partner. By the time they're done with us, we'll be ready to kill anyone they put in front of us, because we'll have learned that everyone dies eventually anyway. The sleeping arrangements were perhaps the most effective part of the entire gladiator training system. They stripped away the basic human need for dignity, privacy, and respect for the dead. They created an environment where death was normalized, where human life was devalued, and where survival became the only meaningful goal, and they worked. After just a few weeks of sleeping alongside corpses, Lucius found that his perspective on life and death had shifted fundamentally. He no longer saw his fellow gladiators as potential friends or allies, but as temporary companions who would inevitably become bedmates of a different sort. He stopped planning for a future beyond the arena, because the constant presence of death had made it clear that such planning was pointless. The school had succeeded in turning him into exactly what they wanted. A man so broken by his conditions that he would do anything, accept anything, become anything, if it meant avoiding the fate that surrounded him every night. He was ready to perform for the crowd. 2 months into his training, Lucius was introduced to what the gladiators called the medicine, a practice so disturbing that new arrivals were usually kept ignorant of it until they were too psychologically broken to resist. It began on a morning when several gladiators had died during particularly brutal training exercises, and the school's physician, a thin, nervous man named Claudius who reeked of wine and failure, announced that it was time for health treatments. "Line up, all of you," Claudius commanded, his voice shaking slightly as it always did when he had to oversee this particular ritual. "Today we begin the blood treatments that will keep you strong enough to provide proper entertainment in the arena." The gladiators shuffled into a rough line, their movements sluggish from the constant malnutrition and psychological abuse. Those who had been in the school longer showed no surprise at the announcement, but Lucius and the other newer arrivals exchanged confused glances. What kind of medical treatment could they possibly receive in a place that seemed designed to destroy their health? The answer came when the guards wheeled in a series of large bronze vessels, each filled with dark red liquid that was still warm and gave off a metallic smell that made Lucius's stomach turn. even before Claudius explained what they were expected to do. The scent told the story. This was blood, human blood, and it was fresh. The blood of fallen gladiators contains essential properties that will enhance your performance in combat, Claudius announced, reciting what was clearly a prepared speech he had given many times before. The courage of the dead passes to the living through consumption of their life essence. Each of you will drink one full cup, and you will do so immediately without complaint. The medical justification was, of course, complete nonsense. There was nothing beneficial about drinking human blood. In fact, consuming large quantities of it could cause serious illness or death. But the practice served several important psychological purposes that made it valuable to the school's operators. First, it was designed to complete the dehumanization process that began with the diet and sleeping arrangements. A man who could be forced to drink the blood of dead colleagues was a man who had surrendered every basic human taboo, every natural instinct, every vestige of civilized behavior. Such a man could be made to do anything second. It created a psychological bond between the gladiators and death itself. By literally consuming the remains of the dead, they were forced to internalize the reality of their own mortality in the most visceral way possible. Death was not something that happened to other people. It was something they carried inside themselves, something they had tasted and swallowed. Third, it served as a form of ritual communion that bound the gladiators together in shared degradation. Men who had been forced to participate in such practices together formed a kind of brotherhood of the damned, united by their mutual shame and their common understanding that they had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. "I won't," said one of the newer gladiators, a young man named Publius who still retained some of his original spirit. "This is madness. I'm not an animal." The response was swift and brutal. 2 guards seized Publius and held him while a third forced his mouth open. Claudius poured an entire cup of blood down his throat while he choked and gagged, then stepped back to observe the result. Anyone else wished to express their objections? Claudius asked mildly, as Publius collapsed to his knees, retching and spitting blood-tinged vomit onto the stone floor. There were no further protests. One by one, the gladiators stepped forward and drank their allotted portion of blood. Some managed to consume it without visible reaction, having learned to suppress their natural responses to survive. Others vomited immediately, but were forced to drink additional cups until they managed to keep the liquid down. When Lucius's turn came, he found that the blood was still warm, with a thick consistency that coated his throat as he swallowed. The taste was indescribable, metallic, salty, organic in a way that made every instinct in his body scream in revulsion. But he forced himself to drink it all, knowing that resistance would only result in worse treatment. The blood we consume today comes from 3 gladiators who died yesterday during training, Claudius continued, as if discussing the weather. Marcellus, who was killed when his opponent's sword pierced his lung. Antonius, who bled to death from wounds to his arms and legs. And young Felix, who was trampled during a practice battle involving multiple fighters. The identification of the sources made the experience even more horrifying. These were men Lucius had known, had trained with, had shared meals and conversations with. Felix had been barely 16, a boy who still cried quietly at night for his mother. Now that boy's blood was coursing through Lucius's digestive system, carrying with it the metallic taste of terror and pain. "You may experience some discomfort over the next few hours," Claudius warned as the ritual concluded. "Nausea, dizziness, hallucinations. These are normal reactions as your body adapts to the enhanced strength provided by the blood. Those who cannot adapt will not survive their next training session." The aftermath was as horrible as promised. Within an hour, most of the gladiators were experiencing violent stomach cramps and vivid, disturbing hallucinations. Lucius found himself seeing the faces of the dead men everywhere he looked, hearing their voices calling his name, feeling their presence beside him as he tried unsuccessfully to sleep. But worse than the physical effects were the psychological ones. The ritual had crossed a line that Lucius hadn't even known existed. He was no longer simply a man forced to fight for entertainment. He was a man who had consumed human flesh and blood, who had participated in a form of cannibalism so ritualized that it felt almost religious. "It gets easier," Marcus told him as they sat together in the training yard the next morning, both struggling with the lingering effects of the blood consumption. "The first time is the worst, but your body adapts, your mind adapts. Eventually, you start to look forward to it." "Look forward to it?" Lucius asked, horrified. "The blood of a brave gladiator does give you something," Marcus explained. "Not strength, not courage. Those are lies they tell us. But it gives you a sense of connection to the dead, a feeling that you're carrying their memories with you. After a while, drinking the blood starts to feel like the only way to honor the men who died in this place." The blood ritual was repeated every few weeks, always coinciding with periods when multiple gladiators had died. Each time, Claudius would provide the same medical justification, and each time, the gladiators would line up with decreasing resistance to consume the warm blood of their fallen colleagues. But Lucius began to notice that the ritual served another, more practical purpose. The school's operators were disposing of evidence. When gladiators died from training injuries, disease, or deliberate abuse, their bodies represented potential legal problems. Families might ask questions, officials might investigate, and the school's profitable operations could be threatened. By feeding parts of the dead gladiators to the living ones, the school was literally making the evidence disappear. The blood was just the beginning. Lucius later learned that ground-up organs were sometimes mixed into their food, and that the mysterious meat they occasionally received during special meals was not actually animal flesh at all. "We're not just eating their blood," he realized one day, watching Claudius prepare the next batch of medicine with suspicious efficiency. "We're eating them. We're disposing of the bodies by consuming them." The revelation was so horrifying that Lucius initially dismissed it as a product of his own increasingly disturbed mental state. But as he observed the process more carefully, the evidence became undeniable. Bodies that disappeared from the sleeping quarters didn't always leave through the front gates. Sometimes they simply vanished gradually, piece by piece, cup by cup. The cannibalistic aspect of gladiator life was never acknowledged officially, but it was understood by everyone involved in the system. It solved multiple problems simultaneously. It disposed of inconvenient corpses. It provided a source of protein for the malnourished fighters, and it completed the psychological destruction of men who might otherwise retain enough humanity to rebel against their conditions. "The blood is nothing compared to what comes later," whispered Gaius one night as they lay in their shared bed. "Wait until you've been here long enough for the special meals. Wait until they start serving you pieces of men you trained with, men you called friends. That's when you really understand what you've become." By the time Lucius had been in the gladiator school for 3 months, the blood rituals had become as routine as the morning training sessions. He no longer felt nausea when consuming the warm blood of dead colleagues. He no longer experienced hallucinations or nightmares afterward. His body and mind had adapted to practices that would have driven his former self to madness. He had become exactly what the system was designed to create. A man so thoroughly broken that he could participate in ritualized cannibalism without question. A man who had internalized his own dehumanization so completely that he no longer recognized it as abnormal. The transformation was nearly complete. All that remained was his first real fight in the arena, where he would discover whether he could translate his degradation into entertainment valuable enough to keep him alive for another day. After 4 months of training, malnutrition, psychological abuse, and ritualized cannibalism, Lucius was finally deemed ready for his debut in the Colosseum. The announcement came without ceremony. A guard simply appeared at his bedside one morning and informed him that he would fight that afternoon in the preliminary matches before the main events that would draw the largest crowds. "You'll be fighting as a retiarius," the guard explained, handing him a set of equipment that consisted of a net, a trident, and minimal armor. "Your opponent is a Murmillo named Decimus, who has won 3 fights and lost 2. The odds favor him, but not overwhelmingly. Try to make it interesting." The casual tone of the announcement reflected the reality of gladiator combat. Individual fights were simply business transactions, opportunities to generate revenue and provide entertainment. Whether Lucius lived or died was less important than whether his death would be sufficiently dramatic to satisfy the crowd and justify the investment. In his training, as he examined his equipment, Lucius realized that everything he had learned about gladiator combat was reflected in the weapons he had been given. The net was designed not to kill efficiently, but to create visually interesting moments of entanglement and struggle. The trident was long enough to keep his opponent at a distance, prolonging the fight, but its 3 prongs made it difficult to land killing blows. Even his minimal armor, just a shoulder guard and arm protection, left most of his body exposed for dramatic, but non-fatal wounds. "Remember what I taught you," Titus said as they walked through the tunnels beneath the arena toward the waiting areas. "The crowd wants to see you suffer, but they also want to see you fight back. Give them moments of hope, followed by moments of despair. Make them believe you might actually win, right up until the moment you lose." The advice was both practical and horrifying. Lucius was being instructed to choreograph his own death, to manipulate the emotions of thousands of spectators who would cheer his agony and applaud his destruction. He was no longer a human being with his own desires and goals. He was a performer whose only purpose was to die in a way that would entertain people who had never faced anything more dangerous than a difficult dinner party. As they approached the arena, the sound of the crowd became audible, a low rumble of anticipation punctuated by cheers and jeers as other fights concluded above them. The noise was overwhelming, a constant reminder that thousands of people were waiting to watch him bleed and possibly die for their amusement. "How many people are up there?" Lucius asked, his voice barely steady. "Today, maybe 15,000 for the afternoon session," Titus replied. "Not a full house, but enough to matter. The emperor isn't attending, so it's mostly merchants, freedmen, women, and children. They're usually more bloodthirsty than the nobility. They have to prove they're sophisticated enough to appreciate the finer points of violent entertainment." The waiting area was a stone chamber directly beneath the arena floor, with a ceiling low enough that tall men had to stoop. Several other gladiators waited there, some preparing for their own fights, others who had already fought and survived. The wounded ones sat quietly, pressing blood-soaked rags against their injuries, while waiting for medical attention that might or might not come. "Look at them," Titus said quietly, gesturing at the wounded fighters. "Those are the lucky ones. They put on good shows, led dramatically, but managed to survive. They'll fight again in a few weeks, after their wounds heal enough for them to perform adequately. The unlucky ones are being dragged out the death gate right now." Through a small opening in the stone wall, Lucius could see bodies being removed from the arena floor. Gladiators who had failed to provide sufficient entertainment, or who had died too quickly to satisfy the crowd's appetite for prolonged suffering. They were unceremoniously dumped onto carts and wheeled away to disposal sites outside the city, where their remains would feed wild animals or fertilize the gardens of the wealthy. "Your turn," announced a guard, appearing suddenly in the waiting area. Time to find out if all that training was worth the investment. Lucius walked through a tunnel that sloped upward toward the arena floor, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it over the noise of the crowd. With each step, the sound grew louder, thousands of voices blending into a roar of anticipation that seemed to shake the stones beneath his feet. Then he emerged into the light, and the full horror of his situation became clear. The Colosseum stretched around him like a bowl designed by gods who had developed a taste for human suffering. Tier upon tier of seats rose toward the sky, filled with people who had paid for the privilege of watching him fight and possibly die. Their faces were flushed with excitement, their voices raised in cheers and calls for blood. They pointed at him, evaluated his physique, made bets on his chances of survival. The arena floor was covered with sand, but Lucius could see that the sand was stained dark in many places where previous fighters had bled out their lives for the entertainment of these same spectators. The smell was overwhelming: blood, sweat, fear, and something else that he recognized from his months of sleeping alongside corpses. The smell of death. At the far end of the arena, another gladiator emerged from a different tunnel. This was Decimus, his opponent, a heavily armored man carrying a sword and shield, moving with the confident stride of someone who had survived multiple arena combats. His armor gleamed in the afternoon sun, but Lucius could see that it bore the scars of previous battles, evidence that entertainment value sometimes required allowing opponents to land dramatic but non-fatal blows. The crowd's roar increased as both fighters walked toward the center of the arena. People were already on their feet, shouting encouragement, insults, and betting odds. Lucius heard fragments of individual voices calling out suggestions for how he should die, predictions about how long he would last, commentary on his physical appearance and fighting stance. "Look at the Gladiators," someone shouted from the lower seats. "He's already shaking with fear. This won't last 5 minutes." "Put your money on the Murmillo," called another voice. "The net fighter looks like he's about to vomit." They were not wrong. Lucius was indeed fighting waves of nausea, partly from the blood ritual he had undergone that morning, partly from the overwhelming realization that he was about to fight for his life, while thousands of strangers cheered for his destruction. As he and Decimus approached each other in the center of the arena, Lucius remembered everything he had learned during his months of training. The techniques for making wounds look worse than they were. The methods for prolonging combat to maximize entertainment value. The ways to manipulate crowd emotions through carefully choreographed displays of courage and desperation. But he also remembered something else, something that all the training and psychological abuse had been designed to make him forget. He remembered that he was a human being, with his own will and his own choices. He could choose to be simply an entertainer who died for the pleasure of others, or he could choose to fight for something more meaningful. The decision would be made in the next few minutes, with thousands of witnesses, and only one chance to get it right. As the referee raised his hand to signal the beginning of combat, Lucius looked up at the sea of faces surrounding him and made a choice that would define his final moments on Earth. He would not die beautifully. He would not perform for their entertainment. He would fight like a man, not like a trained animal. And whatever happened next would happen on his own terms. The crowd fell silent for a moment, sensing that something had changed in the young gladiator's demeanor. Then the referee's hand dropped, and the fight began. The moment combat began, Lucius felt a clarity he hadn't experienced in months. All the training designed to make him an entertainer, all the psychological abuse intended to break his will, all the ritualized degradation meant to turn him into a performing animal. None of it mattered anymore. What mattered was the man with the sword who was already moving toward him with deadly intent. Decimus advanced with the confidence of a veteran, his sword held high and his shield positioned to protect his vital organs. His strategy was obvious and brutal. He would use his superior armor and weapons to methodically break down his lightly protected opponent, creating the kind of extended, dramatic combat that crowds loved to watch. But Lucius had no intention of participating in a scripted performance. Instead of playing his assigned role as the quick, elusive net fighter who would dance around his opponent while gradually being worn down, he did something that took everyone by surprise. He attacked immediately and with lethal intent. The net flew through the air with deadly accuracy, not in the theatrical manner he had been taught, but as a real weapon designed to entangle and disable an enemy. Decimus, expecting the careful, prolonged combat that arena fights were supposed to provide, was caught off guard by the sudden aggression. The net wrapped around his shield arm, pulling him off balance just as Lucius's trident struck toward his throat. Only a quick backward step saved Decimus from immediate death, but the exchange had already changed the dynamic of the fight in ways that sent murmurs of confusion through the crowd. This was not the entertainment they had expected. This was real combat, dangerous and unpredictable, with no concern for dramatic pacing or crowd-pleasing spectacle. "Fight properly, you fool," Decimus hissed as he struggled to free his shield from the net. "We're supposed to give them a show." But Lucius was beyond caring about what the crowd wanted to see. Months of degradation and abuse had burned away everything except a core of desperate humanity that refused to be extinguished. He pressed his attack, using every real combat skill he had learned before entering gladiator school, every technique for actually winning fights rather than simply performing in them. The crowd's initial confusion was giving way to something more complex. Some spectators were thrilled by the unexpectedly intense combat, cheering for the raw violence that was unfolding before them. Others were disturbed by the departure from expected patterns, calling out for the fighters to slow down and provide proper entertainment. Still others seemed to sense that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a gladiator who had chosen to be a warrior rather than a performer. Decimus was a skilled fighter, but his skills had been shaped by years of arena combat, where the goal was entertainment rather than survival. He had learned to fight dramatically rather than efficiently, to wound rather than kill, to provide spectacle rather than achieve victory. Faced with an opponent who was genuinely trying to end his life as quickly as possible, he found himself struggling to adapt. The turning point came when Lucius managed to entangle Decimus's sword arm with his net and pull him forward into range of the trident. Instead of the theatrical thrust to a non-vital area that arena protocol demanded, Lucius drove all 3 points of his weapon deep into his opponent's chest, piercing lungs and heart with a single devastating strike. Decimus collapsed immediately, blood fontaining from his mouth as his punctured lungs filled with fluid. There was no dramatic death speech, no opportunity for the crowd to show mercy or call for execution, no extended suffering to entertain the masses. Just a man dying quickly and efficiently, the way deaths actually occur in real combat. The arena fell silent. This was not what anyone had expected. Gladiator fights were supposed to last longer, provide more entertainment, offer more opportunities for crowd participation. A fight that ended in less than 5 minutes with a decisive killing stroke was almost unheard of, and certainly not what the audience had paid to see. Lucius stood over his opponent's body, the trident still gripped in his hands, and looked up at the thousands of faces staring down at him. For the first time in months, he felt like a human being rather than a trained animal. He had fought on his own terms, used his own skills, made his own choices. He had refused to be entertainment. The crowd's reaction was mixed and confused. Some sections erupted in cheers, excited by the unexpected display of lethal efficiency. Others remained silent, unsure how to respond to a performance that had violated the unspoken rules of arena combat. Still others began to boo, angry at being denied the prolonged spectacle they had expected. The referee looked uncertain, glancing up at the imperial box for guidance that wasn't forthcoming. Normally, a victorious gladiator would appeal to the crowd for approval, would acknowledge their cheers and play to their emotions. But Lucius simply stood motionless, making no effort to engage with the audience or celebrate his victory. That's when the guards appeared. They emerged from multiple entrances around the arena floor, moving with the purposeful stride of men following predetermined orders. Lucius realized immediately what was happening. His victory had been too decisive, too real, too much like actual combat rather than entertainment. He had violated the fundamental principle of gladiator combat by prioritizing winning over performing. "You were supposed to make it last longer," said the lead guard as they surrounded him. "You were supposed to give them a show. Instead, you fought like a soldier instead of a gladiator." Lucius understood. He had committed the ultimate sin in the arena. He had treated it as a real battle rather than a staged performance. By winning quickly and efficiently, he had denied the crowd the extended spectacle they had paid to see. He had proven that he was still a man with his own will rather than a broken animal who would perform on command. The crowd is not pleased, the guard continued. They feel cheated of proper entertainment. Therefore, you will fight again immediately, against fresh opponents, until you either learn to provide proper spectacle or die in the attempt. More gladiators were already emerging from the tunnels, 3 of them this time, all armed and armored, all understanding that their job was not just to defeat the rebellious Retiarius, but to make his defeat as slow and entertaining as possible. They would not make the mistake of treating this as real combat. They would fight as gladiators were supposed to fight, creating the prolonged, dramatic spectacle that the crowd demanded. As the 3 fresh opponents spread out to surround him, Lucius felt a strange sense of peace. He had won one real fight, had proven to himself that he was still capable of being a warrior rather than just an entertainer. Now he would die, but he would die as himself rather than as the broken creature the school had tried to create. The crowd sensed that something special was about to happen. The murmur of conversation died away, replaced by an expectant silence as 15,000 people leaned forward to watch the final performance of a gladiator who had dared to fight like a human being. Lucius raised his trident and faced his 3 opponents, knowing he had no chance of survival, but determined to make his death mean something more than simple entertainment. He had learned to refuse the role that had been assigned to him, had reclaimed his humanity in the only way available to him, and as the 3 gladiators closed in for the kill, he smiled, not for the crowd, but for himself, because he had remembered who he was beneath all the degradation and abuse. He was a man who chose how to fight and how to die, regardless of what anyone else wanted to see. The final battle was brief but fierce. Lucius fought with the desperate courage of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. He killed one of his opponents and seriously wounded another before the 3rd gladiator's sword found his heart. As he fell to the sand, bleeding out his life, while the crowd finally got the dramatic death they had been waiting for. Lucius felt something he hadn't experienced in months: pride, not in providing entertainment, not in pleasing an audience, but in dying as himself rather than as the performing animal he had been trained to become. His last thought, as the roar of the crowd faded into darkness, was that he had won the only victory that truly mattered. He had refused to let them destroy who he was, even though it had cost him his life. The gladiator system had claimed another victim, but it had failed to break the man who lay dying in the blood-stained sand. And sometimes, in a world designed to crush the human spirit, that kind of failure was the most important victory of all.